start the recording. Yes, so the second talk in our session.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. First, Ellen, primary Ellen, for that fascinating talk. And thank you to the organizers who have done an amazing job here. Many of you in the audience may remember a classic paper by Paul Kaparsky called How Abstract is Phonology? I want to think about how abstract is L2 phonology. So this is really about what are the phonological representations. So when we received the invitation to this workshop, we were presented with many questions. Among them, these three questions: how do two phonologies in the same mind interact? In what ways precisely can an L1 influence an L2? And how can the answers to questions like these inform our theories of phonology? So no pressure to answer these questions in 2 hours. The first step, of course, is to, well, what do we mean by phonology? So I assume a model in which there is a production grammar, which maps from lexical or phonological underlying representations to surface representations, and a perception grammar, also language specific, which maps from auditory or acoustic forms to phonetic, phonological, and then lexical representations. Now, in as Ellen, number one, Ellen made very clear, there is a tradition in L2, it's the study of L2 speech, of two very different traditions of people who often don't talk to each other. So there's the phonetic approach, which Ellen outlined, approach associated with people like Flega and Best, which focuses on the surface subphonemic phonetic features of the L2. And then there is a more phonological approach, which it starts from the position that the mapping from a second language to a first language is driven by the phonological features, the more abstract features, specifically contrastive features. To illustrate, I'm just going to look at two analyses of the same, look at two phenomena which have been analyzed in different ways in these traditions. These are both about loanword adaptation, which is the place where I think you see, the clearest evidence of L1 influence, even though adaptation is also often carried out by bilingual speakers. So the first example is gemination that you see in words borrowed from English into Japanese. So Japanese speakers typically adapt English tense vowels as long and lax vowels as short, because the restrictions on possible syllable codas are very strict. In Japanese, you often find insertion of a vowel after a word final non-nasal consonant. And you often find this word final consonant geminating following a lax vowel, but not a tense vowel. So no gemination in heat, but gemination in hit. So there is a dissertation out of UC Santa Cruz, which gives a very phonologically based analysis of this phenomenon of gemination. So the proposal is that the Japanese speakers recognize that these word final consonants are affiliated with syllable coda position. They would like to preserve that syllable affiliation, but of course, T is not a possible coda in Japanese. So the way to put a vowel after the final consonant, but also maintain its affiliation with the coda, is to geminate that consonant. This happens after a short vowel, English lax vowel, but not after a long vowel, because Japanese does not allow trimeric syllables, and that would create a trimeric syllable. Alongside, but not engaging with that analysis, is a study by Takagi and Men, which says this is about the VC ratio in English and Japanese. the ratio of duration of a lax vowel followed by a consonant is similar to the ratio of a Japanese short vowel followed by a geminate consonant. The English long vowel consonant is similar to the English tense vowel consonant is similar in ratio to the Japanese long vowel single consonant. So when I first read this paper, I thought, oh, but the phonological analysis is so beautiful. But the phenomenon is actually considerably more complicated than I have made it seem. And you do need quite a number of workarounds to make a purely phonological account work here. So a second example, a second set of data also has to do with tense and lax vowels. So Korean speakers, as many people have discussed, often insert a vowel after a word final stop in an English word, even when the stop would be a legal coda in Korean. So this is what has been termed unnecessary repair. This unnecessary vowel insertion is more likely when the stop follows a tense vowel in English than when it follows a lax vowel. So beat, but bit, or beat. So I have a very old paper with Hebe Park where we argued that for a phonological analysis of this, that the reason the vowel is inserted after a tense vowel is because in English, tense vowels are bimeraic. Korean is, it seems to be losing a vowel length contrast, so cannot make the beat bit distinction in terms of the vowel mora count. And so adding another vowel is a way of preserving the second mora that you find in beat. And this is sort of the mirror image of, if this is correct, this is the mirror image of a process that Bruce Hayes identified in Middle English, in the development of English, where you lost a final schwa in a word like tala. And because that schwa was lost, but you wanted to preserve the mora, you lengthened the preceding vowel. So someone who read this paper said to me, but you know, this is obviously wrong. It's obviously about the release of the final consonant. And I thought, oh, really? But that's so much less interesting. It's so less intricate. But then, of course, there's a paper by Yoon-Jung Kang, which presents very comprehensive arguments that this is about final release. So final stops are never released in Korean. They are optionally or variably released in English. Post-stop vowel insertion, she argues, is done in order to maintain perceptual similarity between an English release stop and the closest thing you can have in Korean, which is a stop followed by a short vowel. And she shows lots of evidence that from corpus studies that of loan words and of English pronunciation, that there is a very good correlation between the likelihood of release of a stop in different contexts and the likelihood of that being adapted with a vowel. So I was convinced that the phonetic account, or the semi-phonetic, mixed phonetic phonological account of Kang is definitely the right way to go. But I see on the program there is what looks like a very interesting talk tomorrow, which is actually questioning Kang's findings or Kang's treatment of the tense lax distinction. So these questions are not settled. And partly the reason they don't get settled is because, as number one Ellen said, the people don't necessarily talk to each other from these different traditions. So what I would like to argue is that these two traditions often are presented as, is something phonetics or is it phonology? And I think that that is a false dichotomy that rests on just different ideas about what phonology is. So there are actually big divergences, even among people who call themselves phonologists, in terms of what is a lexical representation. So the sort of classic sound pattern of English approach or assumption is that you want your lexicon to be as economical as possible. You want to store as little as possible. So you store only contrastive, non-predictable information. And an even sort of more extreme version of this is the fully underspecified lexicon model associated with Aditi Lahiri and others, which says, even contrastive features might be unspecified if they can be filled in by default. And they present arguments that in processing, only specified features are relevant. At the sort of opposite end here is the optimality theory view that lexical representations can contain anything. You don't care what's in the lexical. I mean, they have to contain contrastive information, but they can contain all sorts of predictable phonetic-y information. And in fact, the lexicon optimization principle suggests that that you assume the UR is the same as the surface unless there's a reason to assume otherwise. And it doesn't matter because the production grammar is going to sort things out and it's going to make sure that the predictable information is realized correctly and that contrasts are realized correctly. So these contrasting views also are mirrored in L2 perception and in theories of L2 perception. So there are the claims by people like Cynthia Brown and Barbara Hansen-Bott that L2 listeners perceive the foreign language in terms of the contrastive features of their L1. So it's very hard, the claim is very hard to learn a new contrast if you don't have a feature that makes that contrast in your L1. And then on the other hand, there are models like the Escudero and Bursma model, which says the L2 perception grammar can utilize any available cues, contrastive, predictable, but the rankings may induce greater attention or greater weight to particular cues. So the focus of this talk is really in much of the work on loanword phonology and also much of the work in second language phonology is, is this phonological or is it phonetics? What are listeners paying attention to? And I think that question disappears if you have a model of the phonological grammar that allows you to refer to both sorts of information, phonological and phonetic. So the question really is, well, how do phonological and phonetic features interact in the perception grammar? So I don't, have an answer to this, but I will look at one set of data, and the goal here is just to make the point that the idea that contrastive features are somehow privileged in over redundant features in L2 perception is not, or L1 perception is not necessarily sustainable. So I'm going to look at, again, mapping from English to Korean, this time the mapping of liquid contrasts. And I'm going to argue that L1 Korean listeners preserve the feature that is redundant in their L1 rather than the contrastive feature. And they do this because that's how their L1 perception grammar works. So I want to here give a shout out to my brilliant collaborators without whom life would not be worth living. The data that we've been looking at is the adaptation of English intervocalic liquids. And many, many people have written about this phenomenon. So typically English intervocalic L is, in borrowed words, is mapped to Korean geminate L. English intervocalic R is mapped to Korean R, though there are a number of doublets, like kilo you find both kilo and kilo. This mapping is surprising for several reasons. One, it's not an ideal acoustic fit. So English R, at least in initial position, is longer than English L. And Korean geminate L is considerably longer than English single L. So the English, in order to adapt the English single L to the Korean geminate L, you have to accept this much longer length. And in terms of the phoneme system, this is surprising because singleton liquids in Korean are in complementary distributions. So there are very productive alternations between single L and the tap. So single L appears in coda, the tap appears in onset. So on the view that perception is filtered through the L1 contrastive categories, we would expect Korean listeners not to pay any attention to the difference between R and L if they're interpreting R as if they're interpreting English R as their tap. So then they should merge it with English L. But instead, Korean does have this other contrast between tap, single tap, and geminate L, as in words like muri, muli. So they're mapping English R to this single liquid contrast, which varies between tap and single L in coda. And they're mapping English single L to Korean geminate L. This just shows you that the F2 values of L spoken by Koreans and English speakers are not the same, and the kinematic effects are not quite the same. So another reason why this mapping is surprising is it's inconsistent with the L1 production grammar. So in Korean, yes, there's a restriction. You cannot have single L between vowels. So a way of viewing this is L must be affiliated with a coda position, or it must be Moraic. It must be in a Moraic position. And the native language repair is L becomes tap. But the foreign repair for an intervocalic L is to geminate it. So this doesn't come from the native language grammar, this foreign repair, and it's very hard to see how the data of English could motivate speakers to believe that you should have a gemination process for L. So we would actually need two different production grammars, one for Korean and one for the adaptation of loanwords, with different rankings for the constraints that demand keep the same more count and keep the same value for the feature of lateral. Another reason why this mapping is surprising now is that if you look at the contrasts of Korean, you have for nasals, you have a contrast between singleton and geminate, and that contrast is just a contrast in length. So kanan, kanan, kama, kama. If we look at the whole system, anybody in Phonology 1 is going to say, well, the contrastive feature for these three sets of contrasts is length, and then there's a secondary predictable redundant difference in laterality for liquids. But in the English to Korean mapping, it's the laterality feature that's preserved for the liquids, and it's the length contrast that you give up, or you give up the original length. So one question is, well, maybe this is just an effect of orthography, because in English we do often use two L's to spell L. So O looked at this and found that yes, when the English spelling involves two L's in 99% of the adaptations, the adapted form has a geminate L. But even for single L spelling, you still get an overwhelming preference for adaptation with the geminate L rather than the tap. So there's a strong preference for the geminate adaptation. And we can contrast this with loans with double N spelling, where, if the orthography has an effect, we'd expect that you'd prefer the double N adaptation here. But in fact, there's an overwhelming preference for single N adaptation. Another possible explanation is that, this is just mapping. You have a two-way contrast in English, you have a different two-way contrast in Korean, but it's close enough. And so you just want to preserve that contrast. And of course, there's something right about that, but it is important to note that this contrast between R and L in English is not always preserved in Korean borrowings. So in initial position, you can get neutralization in things like rope and lobby. Notice you could have preserved the L in lobby by inserting a vowel in front of, at the beginning of the word, and then geminating the L, which is in fact what is often done with L in initial clusters. So it's not impossible to insert a vowel, but they don't always do it. So, so the claim that we want to test is in the production grammar, Koreans privilege duration over laterality. But in the perception grammar, they privilege laterality over duration because this is what they do in their L1 perception. And the evidence, the initial evidence for that is that comes from a study by Kim, where Korean speakers in Korea were given real words like muri and muli, and nonce words created by editing down the geminate L to the duration of the tap. And they were given a forced choice. You hear this muli, which is phonologically ambiguous, and they were asked, which word is this? And you can see that that for the real words, they, correctly identified this as, okay, this is the tap word, this is the geminate L word. For the edited forms, the single L forms, there was a very strong preference for hearing that as the geminate, or identifying it as the geminate L word. So we wanted to just sort of go take this idea a little further and look a little more into Korean speakers' perception. So we did 3 types of experiments. First, a discrimination experiment. So we created non-word forms, but legal forms like elle and ere, and enne and ene. And then we created a long tap. And of course, you can't just lengthen the closure duration of a tap. So this was, very distinct in that it was basically a trill. And we created the short L using Kim's closure duration measurements. And we just did an AXB discrimination task. And what we found is that when you have laterality alone, discrimination was as good as when you had both laterality and duration. So, in the real language forms, of course, you have those 2 cues, laterality and duration, but people were just as good when you gave them short L versus short tap, or long L versus long tap, or double tap. The one place where they were not so good was distinguishing long L from short L. So Okay, so then we did a categorization experiment. So this was different from Kim's in that these were not real words. This was just, which is this? And we also changed the closure durations. So Huang and Oh looked at the closure durations in Korean speakers productions and found that the differences between the geminate L and the tap work seemed to be bigger than the differences that Kim had argued for or had used. And so we basically made the long L and the tap more different and looked at whether that made a difference. So again, people were categorizing, real legal forms, elle, ere, and illegal forms, elle, ere. And here you can see for the legal forms, can people see my cursor? So this is two groups of participants, one group in the US and one group in Korea, because we also wondered whether the context, being in an English context versus a Korean context, made a difference. And the two groups behaved surprisingly similarly. So both liked, the double L was heard as a double L, the tap was heard as a tap. Then for the edited short L, there was a lot of individual variation, but still tending, preferences certainly leaning toward hearing this as the geminate L. If you look at by participant, sorry, I'm just looking at time here.
You've got about
You can
30.
see again, thank you, a lot of variation. But in general, so a lot of variation across speakers in terms of their, whether for the short L, whether they responded that was the geminate L. There are a few weird people down here at the R end, but in general, the majority of participants categorized the short L stimuli, over 50% of the short L stimuli as geminate L. So the final experiment, which is still actually going on because this is originally conceived of as an ERP experiment where we were looking for the N400 response, which indicates semantic incongruity of a word. But we still need to run more subjects to have real solid ERP data. But we also included a behavioral component where people just said, is this sentence good or is it bad? So they heard a sentence with a word containing tap, a word containing geminate L, or an phonologically ambiguous short L word. And these three types of stimuli were embedded into two different contexts, one where the tap word makes sense, one where the geminate L word makes sense. And of course, we would expect if Korean speakers are more sensitive to laterality than duration, then the sentences with the short L stimuli should be judged as ill-formed when they expect a tap word and well-formed when they expect a geminate L word. And so here at the top row is shows you where the real word was in the good context. So for the L words, they were, judged good in the L context. The R words were judged as good in the L context. When you switch them, an R word in an L context, an L word in an R context, you got the reverse judgments. The interesting row is the bottom row where you had the phonologically ambiguous words. And you can see again while the tendency is not nearly as robust as when you had real words, it's in the same direction that they were much more likely to accept a short L in a context where they expected geminate L. And again, there was a lot of individual variations. So in the LL context, actually not huge amounts of variation. There are more variation in the R context. But if you break out for each speaker, their judgments of the ambiguous stimulus in the L context versus the R context, there was nobody who went in the opposite direction. Some people accepted both, both the short L in both contexts equally, but nobody was more likely to accept L in a tap context. So, so this is consistent with the claim that in their L1 perception, Korean listeners weight the laterality cue more highly, even though it's redundant, according to economical principles. And this is also, of course, consistent with their adaptation of English forms. So if we wanted to make a grammar of what Koreans have, the way the Korean speakers are mapping, are they interpreting the acoustic signal, we would need both phonological and phonetic constraints. We'd need something, first of all, to encourage them to decide that the L is the short L is in onset rather than coda. And then the Korean thing that says the lateral has to be in coda is that you can't have an onset lateral is necessary. And then you need things to tell them, first of all, why do they decide that this is a liquid? We left that part out here, but once it's a liquid, then the third formant value is going to tell them whether to interpret it as L or as tap. And then the closure duration is going to tell them whether to interpret it as singleton or geminate, but that is going to be weighted less highly than the laterality constraint. And of course, we need to allow variability because, as Ellen established, these representations are very flexible. So the models that provide the best fit with the L2 to L1 mappings are those that allow reference to all types of information and that allow for variability in the mapping. And so we no longer need to think in terms of, is it phonetics or phonology? I think am I out of time?
No, you still have about 5 minutes.
Okay, yes, good. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about a little bit of additional evidence for L1 based cue sensitivity in L2 perception. So I am hoping that Charles will talk in more depth about this, but he has interesting results showing that non-native speakers may outperform native speakers. So L1 Korean speakers actually did better than English speakers in perceiving English word final consonant contrasts. And then in terms of prosody, there's a study showing that L1 Cantonese speakers outperformed English speakers in identifying the position of stress in English words. Though only when pitch cues to stress were present. So a study by Choi 2021 removes different cues to stress and finds that the Cantonese speakers, as long as you have pitch the Cantonese speakers are better than the English speakers in identifying where is the position of the stress syllable. So this is clearly because in Cantonese, a tone language, pitch cues are important and Cantonese speakers are sensitive to those cues. But it's not as simple as sensitivity to a particular cue, because in studies of Mandarin speakers, interpretation of English contrastive focus, Mandarin speakers have not been shown to outperform English speakers. even in a study where the only cue that was available so all the segmental information was taken away. So what we did was give people, this was an eye tracking experiment, and people would see something like click on the scarlet mittens there with a picture of scarlet mittens. Then the next screen would have various objects. One would be mittens of a different color. And the instruction would be now click on the with contrastive focus on the adjective, or now click on the with contrastive focus on the noun. The Mandarin speakers we thought might do better than the English speakers because all that's left is pitch, and they're good at pitch. But in fact, they underperformed the English speakers. So this is, again, the phonetic cue is very salient if your L1 uses it, but it has to also play a similar phonological role in the L1 and L2. Cantonese speakers can use pitch to identify English stress position because pitch cues signal something similar in both languages. Stress is a lexical level phenomenon signaling used in English to signal lexical contrasts. In Cantonese, of course, pitch is also used to signal lexical contrasts. But the way pitch is used in Mandarin is quite different from, obviously, from the way it's used in English. In Mandarin, in English, we use pitch to signal information structure like focus. In Mandarin, you're limited in the extent to which you can use pitch to signal focus because you have to maintain the lexical pitch contrasts. And so there's no nice one-to-one mapping between pitch contours and focus. So, so having started my career in team phonology and thinking the most interesting kinds of analyses are those that refer to abstract phonological features, I'm now thinking, no, we're all right. And we just need to sort of talk to each other and build a model that accounts for the data in all its complexity.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I shall applaud, and many other people are applauding in the chat. Absolutely, yes. So, thank you, Ellen. And now, again, write down your questions if you what you're thinking about.